They were the spoiled sons of the region's wealthiest landowner. Twins infamous for tormenting those who couldn't defend themselves. On that suffocating afternoon in 1858, they selected the most fragile victim, an enslaved mother, exhausted, who could barely stand after laboring in the field since before dawn. They laughed at her, pushed her, knocked her to the ground, humiliated her as if she were nothing. What they didn't know was that she had a son, an enormous young man, deaf since birth, who understood the world through vibrations in the ground and his mother's gaze. 3 hours later, as the sun began to set, he saw his mother bloodied and in shock. And there, every limit ended. The 7-foot-2-inch young man entered the mansion silently, driven by a mute fury no one had ever witnessed. The wealthy twins never heard their own sentence. They only felt his presence behind the door. And then the terror began. Before we continue this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe and comment "Freedom" so I know who you are. Thank you, and let's continue. The midday heat transformed the Belmont estate into an open-air furnace. It was August 3, 1858, and the interior of São Paulo was suffering through one of the worst droughts of the decade. The cracked earth spat dust with each step, and the air seemed to burn the lungs of anyone who breathed too deeply. Helena walked bent over between the coffee plants, carrying a basket of beans that weighed almost as much as she did. She was 38 years old but looked 20 years older. Her calloused hands bled at the fingertips, and her curved back told the story of 2 decades breaking her body in the harvest. The Belmont estate had belonged to the Drummond family for 3 generations. Colonel Antonio Drummond was the patriarch, a 62-year-old man whose wealth came from 120 acres of land and more than 300 people held in captivity. He rarely appeared in the fields. He preferred to supervise from afar, leaving the dirty work to brutal overseers who managed through fear. But it was his twin sons, Bernardo and Baltazar, who represented the worst of purposeless cruelty. At 24 years old, the two had never worked a single day. They had been raised to inherit everything, to command without question, to exercise absolute power over lives they considered less valuable than livestock. Bernardo was the more vocal of the two, tall with dark hair combed with imported brilliantine, always wearing expensive clothes that obscenely contrasted with the surrounding misery. He wore a small whip at his waist, not because he needed it, but because he liked the way people looked at him when they saw it. Baltazar was quieter, but no less cruel. He had the same appearance as his brother, they were physically identical. But where Bernardo was theatrical in his violence, Baltazar was calculated. He observed, planned, found people's vulnerabilities, and exploited them with surgical precision. Together they formed a duo feared by everyone on the estate. They had the habit of choosing random targets for their cruel amusements, a man falsely accused of theft and publicly whipped, a woman forced to work even when sick until she collapsed, children separated from their mothers on a whim, just to see the desperation in the eyes of those who loved them. That afternoon, they were bored. They had spent the morning drinking French wine on the veranda of the main house, playing cards and complaining about the heat. Their father was away on business in Santos, and their mother, Dona Amelia, spent the day locked in her chambers with her maids, ignoring everything that happened beyond her silk curtains. It was Bernardo who saw Helena first. She had stumbled on the uneven ground, spilling half the beans from her basket. She was on her knees, gathering them one by one with trembling hands, knowing she would be punished for the loss. "Look at that, Baltazar," said Bernardo, pointing with his wine glass. Helena messed up again. Baltazar rose from his chair, a slow smile forming on his face. "Let's go see this up close." The two descended from the veranda with the tranquility of those who know no one will question them. Their footsteps raised clouds of dust as they approached Helena, who continued on her knees, pretending not to notice their approach. But she knew. Of course she knew. Everyone on the estate developed a sixth sense for detecting danger. And the Drummond twins were danger in its purest form. "Helena," called Bernardo, stopping a few steps from her. "How many times have you been told to be careful with the harvest?" She didn't respond, just continued collecting the beans, head down. Responding could be interpreted as insolence. Not responding could, too. There was no safe option. "She's ignoring you, brother," said Baltazar, circling Helena like a predator. "I think she went deaf." must run in the family. The reference to Helena's son was intentional and cruel. Balthazar knew exactly what he was doing. Bernardo moved closer, kicking the basket and scattering the rest of the beans across the ground. Now you'll have to gather everything again. It'll take hours, maybe all night. Helena clenched her fists but kept her head down. She had learned over years of suffering that showing anger only made things worse. She had learned to swallow humiliation, to transform pain into something small and hard inside her chest, something she could carry without letting it show. But Bernardo and Balthazar weren't satisfied with just throwing the beans on the ground. "Stand up," ordered Bernardo. Helena obeyed slowly, her legs protesting after hours of working without rest. She measured just over 5 feet 3 inches, too thin, with bones marked under her dark skin. Next to the well-fed and healthy twins, she seemed even more fragile. "You have a son, don't you?" asked Balthazar casually, as if making polite conversation. Helena's heart raced, but she kept her face impassive. "Yes, sir." "What's his name again?" Balthazar looked at his brother with false confusion. "That big one. The deaf one." "Daniel," responded Helena, her voice coming out lower than intended. "Ah, yes, Daniel." Bernardo smiled. "Poor thing. Can't even hear when someone speaks to him. Must be difficult having a son like that." "Defective." The word fell between them like a stone in still water. Helena felt something break inside her, but she forced herself to continue in silence. Daniel wasn't defective. He was different, yes, but he was strong, intelligent, capable of things these two spoiled fools would never comprehend. Daniel was 22 years old and measured 7 feet 2 inches tall. He had been born deaf, the result of a fever Helena had during pregnancy. The first years were difficult. She didn't know how to communicate with him, how to teach him about a world he couldn't hear. But Daniel learned in other ways. He learned to read people's lips, to interpret facial expressions, to feel vibrations in the ground that indicated someone approaching. He developed extraordinary spatial awareness, always knowing who was nearby, even without seeing them. And he was strong, incredibly strong. Since childhood, he could lift logs that grown men couldn't move. He worked in the estate sawmill, cutting and stacking wood, his strength being exploited while his condition was used to justify even more miserable wages, even in a system where no one received real wages. But above all, Daniel was kind. He had an enormous heart, helped the weak, carried burdens for sick people, shared his food when someone went hungry. Helena knew her son had inherited from her a kindness the world constantly tried to crush. And now these two demons were using his name as a weapon. "You know what I think," said Bernardo, taking a step closer to Helena. "I think you should be more careful. A woman with a son like that needs to work double to compensate for his defect. Don't you agree?" Helena remained silent, but her eyes began to shine with unshed tears. Not from sadness, but from impotent rage. "She's not agreeing," observed Balthazar. "Maybe she needs a lesson." That's when Bernardo pushed Helena. It wasn't hard, just a casual push on the shoulder, but she was exhausted and off balance. She fell backward onto the dry earth, raising a cloud of dust. Pain exploded in her spine, and she stifled a scream. The twins laughed. "Look at that." "She fell again," said Balthazar. "How clumsy." Helena tried to get up, but Bernardo placed his boot on her chest, pushing her back to the ground. It wasn't excessive force, just enough to humiliate, to demonstrate power, to remind her that she had no rights, no dignity, was nothing but property. "Stay there," ordered Bernardo, "until we decide if you can get up." Other enslaved people were working nearby, but no one looked. No one could look. Interfering would invite the same violence or worse. This was the cruel reality of the place. Everyone survived by keeping their heads down, protecting themselves as they could, knowing that heroism meant death. Balthazar crouched beside Helena, studying her face as if she were an interesting insect. "You know we can do whatever we want with you, right? My father owns everything here. This land, this plantation, your defective son." "He's not defective." The words came out before Helena could stop them. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Bernardo removed his foot from Helena's chest, but only to kick her in the ribs. It wasn't a kick hard enough to break bones, but enough to knock the air from her lungs and fill her with pain. "I didn't tell you to speak," said Bernardo, his voice low and threatening. Helena curled up, wrapping her arms around her ribs, trying to breathe through the pain. Tears finally streamed down her face, drawing clean lines in the dust covering her skin. "I don't think she's learned yet," said Balthazar, standing up. "We'll continue the lesson later when we have more time." The two walked away, their laughter echoing through the coffee grove as they returned to the main house. They left Helena lying on the ground, surrounded by scattered coffee beans, each breath hurting, each movement an effort. It took 15 minutes for Helena to manage to sit up. Every movement was agony, as if her body were being torn from the inside. She knew she had at least one cracked rib, maybe two. She had been through this before. Violence wasn't new, it was the fabric of daily life. But this time was different. Not because of the intensity of the physical pain, but because of the mention of Daniel. They had used her son's name as bait, as a form of psychological torture. And Helena knew they wouldn't stop. The Drummond twins were like that. When they found a wound, they kept poking until it tore completely. She needed to warn Daniel. She needed him to stay away from the twins, to be careful, to not give them reasons to be noticed. With painful movements, Helena gathered the scattered beans, working through the pain because not working meant even worse punishment. The sun continued merciless, and sweat mixed with tears on her face. It took 2 more hours to complete the task that would normally take 30 minutes. When she finally finished, she carried the basket to the storage shed. Each step torture, each breath reminding her of the kick she had received. Daniel was in the sawmill, cutting Peroba Roxa boards. The work required immense strength. The manual saw was heavy, and the dense wood resisted each movement. But he worked with rhythmic efficiency, his powerful muscles moving the saw in long, precise strokes. He didn't hear his mother approaching, obviously, but he felt the vibration of her steps on the wooden floor of the shed. He turned, a smile beginning to form on his face until he saw her expression. Daniel dropped the saw immediately, running to Helena. His enormous hands gently touched his mother's face, wiping away the tears mixed with dust. His dark eyes examined her with intense concern, searching for injuries. Helena touched her son's face, forcing herself to smile reassuringly. Then slowly, using the signs they had developed over the years, a mixture of natural gestures and exaggerated facial expressions, she began to tell him what had happened. Daniel's hands closed into fists as she spoke. His immense body became rigid, muscles tensing under his worn shirt. His eyes darkened with a rage Helena rarely saw. Her son was gentle by nature, slow to anger, but when something touched him deeply, the fury was frightening. He looked toward the main house, visible through the trees on top of the hill. Helena saw the intention in his eyes before he even moved. She grabbed Daniel's arm, shaking her head violently. Her fingers squeezed his skin, trying to convey the urgency, the danger, the inevitability of destruction if he did what he was thinking. Daniel looked at her, and Helena saw the devastating conflict in his eyes. She saw the gentle boy she had raised warring with the men who needed to protect his mother. She saw love colliding with helplessness, rage hitting against the brutal reality of their situation. Finally, slowly, Daniel nodded. But Helena knew her son. She knew that look. He wasn't agreeing to let it go. He was just postponing, processing, planning. She pulled his head down, pressing her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a long moment, mother and son, united in suffering, in love, in a world that treated them as less than human but couldn't take from them what made them human, the capacity to care for each other. When they separated, Helena made one last gesture, a silent request for him to be careful, to stay away from the twins, to survive. Daniel nodded again, but his eyes remained fixed on the direction of the main house for a long time after Helena left. The following hours passed in growing tension. Helena tried to work, but the pain in her ribs made each movement agony. Other workers noticed. They always noticed when someone was injured because everyone knew they could be next. An older woman named Rosa, who worked in the kitchen of the main house, brought an herbal compress for Helena when the sun began to lower. Rosa was 60 years old, and there was nothing left that could shock her. "The master's boys did this," she asked quietly, helping Helena apply the compress to her ribs. Helena only nodded. "They're getting worse," said Rosa, shaking her head. "Since the colonel started spending more time away, they're doing whatever they want. No one can control them anymore." "I'm afraid for Daniel," admitted Helena, her voice barely audible. Rosa looked at her with compassion and something more, a deep understanding of maternal fear that all the women there shared. "Daniel is strong, but strength is nothing against." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Both knew strength was nothing against the law, against guns, against an entire system designed to crush any sign of resistance. Meanwhile, in the main house, the twins dined in abundance, plates of roasted meat, potatoes, fresh vegetables, red wine. Donna Amelia presided over the table in silence, choosing to ignore her son's cruel comments about the day's incidents. "That Helena is too weak," said Bernardo, cutting a large piece of meat. "She fell with just a little push. Barely worth what father paid for her." Her son, though, Balthazar smiled. "He could be interesting. Did you see the size of that fellow? Must be over 7 feet tall. And deaf," added Bernardo. "No use being big if you're defective." "I was thinking," Balthazar picked up his wine glass, swirling the liquid thoughtfully. "It would be interesting to test his limits. See how far a deaf giant can be pushed before he reacts." Bernardo laughed. "Are you proposing an experiment?" "I'm proposing fun," corrected Balthazar. "We're bored. Father travels for weeks. We have nothing interesting to do. Why not see what happens when we push someone everyone says is meek as a lamb?" "He could break you in half," observed Bernardo, but his tone was one of excitement, not concern. "Then we'd have reason to hang him." Balthazar smiled coldly. "Either way, we'd have fun." That's how their minds worked. Human beings were games. Suffering was entertainment. Absolute power generated absolute cruelty. They had never known consequences for their actions, had never felt real fear, had never been forced to see the people they mistreated as anything beyond property. And this lack of empathy, this complete dehumanization, was about to lead them to a mistake that would change everything. After dinner, as night fell over the estate, the twins smoked cigars on the veranda, planning. The sky was clear, full of stars, and the air finally began to cool after the brutal heat of the day. "Tomorrow," decided Bernardo, "we'll go to the sawmill. We'll have a conversation with Daniel." "You think he'll understand?" asked Balthazar. "Being deaf and all." "He doesn't need to understand words to understand a whip," responded Bernardo, tapping ashes from his cigar. "And his mother will understand for him." They laughed, that cruel sound that had become the soundtrack of the estate. They didn't know that in the darkness beyond the veranda, someone was watching. Daniel had come to check on his mother again, too worried to concentrate on work. He was standing in the shadows between the trees when he saw the 2 young men on the veranda of the main house. He couldn't hear them, obviously, but he read their lips through the distance and the dim light of the lanterns. He read every word, understood every intention, saw in their smiles the same cruelty he had seen in so many other white faces throughout his life. And something inside him, something his mother had tried to protect, something gentle and hopeful that still existed despite everything, that something finally broke. Daniel wasn't like his counterpart in Samuel's story. He didn't have the patience cultivated over years, didn't have the developed philosophy of resistance through dignity. He was younger, more impulsive, and something in him recognized that kindness in that world was frequently confused with weakness. He stood there in the darkness, looking at the 2 men who were planning to torture him the next day, and for the first time in his life, Daniel allowed himself to think about violence. Not because he wanted to be violent, his nature fought against the idea, but because he recognized that some monsters responded to nothing but fear. And if the Drummond twins planned to make him a target for their amusement, he needed to decide, would he be a victim, or would he be something they never expected? The sun had set completely when Daniel finally moved away from the shadows, returning to the slave quarters where his mother waited. Helena saw something different in his eyes when he entered. A decision made, a line crossed internally. She touched her son's face, her eyes asking a silent question. Daniel just hugged his mother, holding her carefully so as not to hurt her injured ribs. And in that embrace, Helena felt something that filled her with terror and pride in equal measures. Her son was no longer the gentle boy she had raised. The world had forced that boy to become something else. The night advanced slowly. Most people slept, too exhausted to do anything else. But Daniel remained awake, staring at the thatched ceiling, thinking. He thought about all the times he had been called defective, useless, less than human because of his deafness. He thought about all the moments he had seen his mother humiliated, hurt, treated like nothing. He thought about the system that allowed two spoiled young men to torture people for fun without consequences, without justice. And he thought about something an older man named Pedro had once told him through gestures and expressions, the world will try to make you small. Never let it. Your height isn't just body. It's spirit. And spirit they can't break unless you let them. Daniel wasn't going to let them. When the sun rose on August 4th, Daniel was awake, prepared, and for the first time in his life, truly dangerous. The 4th day of August, 1858, dawned even hotter than the previous day. The air was thick, loaded with the promise of a storm that never came. People woke early as always, beginning another day of work under the merciless sun. Helena could barely move. The pain in her ribs had worsened during the night, and each breath was a stab of agony. Rosa came to help her stand, bringing more herbal compresses and a worried look. "You should stay today," Rosa whispered. "You're too injured." But both knew there was no such option. Not working meant punishment, and punishment meant more pain, or worse. Helena dragged herself outside, ready for another day of torment. Daniel was already at the sawmill when the sun rose completely over the horizon. He had arrived before all the other workers, which was unusual. Normally, he worked at his own pace, arriving when necessary. But today was different. He was preparing, organizing tools, studying the space, positioning things in specific ways. To anyone watching, it looked like just an efficient worker organizing his area. But Daniel had a plan. The Drummond twins woke late as always. They ate a leisurely breakfast, eggs, fresh bread, strong coffee, fruit. Donna Amelia vaguely asked about their plans for the day, and Bernardo responded with a smile, "We're going to do an inspection of the sawmill, check if the work is being done properly." Baltazar smiled, too. And Donna Amelia pretended not to notice the sinister meaning behind those smiles. She had become an expert at not noticing things over the years. It was almost 10 o'clock in the morning when the twins finally left the main house. They walked slowly through the property, watching people work, making cruel comments to each other, enjoying the feeling of absolute power. When they arrived at the sawmill, they found Daniel working alone. The other men who normally worked there had been sent to help with a broken fence, a convenient coincidence the twins didn't question. Daniel didn't hear them enter, obviously, but he felt the vibration of their boots on the wooden boards. He turned slowly, facing the two men who had hurt his mother the day before. For the first time, the twins really looked at Daniel, not as property or a tool, but as a physical presence, and what they saw made them hesitate for a moment. Daniel measured 7 feet 2 inches, but it wasn't just the height. It was the width of his shoulders, the thickness of his arms, the hands the size of plates. It was the way he filled the space, how his presence seemed to reduce everything around him. It was the eyes, dark, intense, fixed on the twins with a quality they couldn't name but that made something primitive in their bellies contract. Bernardo was the first to recover his composure. "So, you're Daniel, the deaf giant everyone talks about." Daniel read his lips perfectly. He didn't respond. "He can't hear you, idiot," said Baltazar, pushing his brother playfully. "You have to speak louder." They laughed at this cruel and senseless joke. Daniel remained motionless, just watching. "Your mother took a fall yesterday," continued Bernardo, approaching. "She was very clumsy. I hope she learned to be more careful." Daniel read every word. His fists slowly closed at his sides. Baltazar noticed. Look, he understood. Smarter than he looks, this one. But is he smart enough to know his place? It seems like everyone on this estate is forgetting. Bernardo was only a meter away now. Forgetting that we command, that you obey. He extended his hand and poked Daniel's chest with his index finger. It was a small gesture, almost physically insignificant, but loaded with meaning. It was challenge, disrespect, assertion of dominance. Daniel looked at the finger pressed against his chest, then back at Bernardo's face. He didn't move. "See," said Bernardo to his brother, smiling, meek as a lamb. "All that size, and he's good for nothing but cutting wood." That's when they made the fatal mistake. Balthazar approached from the other side, and the two began circling Daniel, studying him like a curious animal. They made comments about his size, his deafness, his usefulness, speaking as if he weren't there or as if he couldn't understand. But Daniel understood perfectly. He saw every word formed on their lips, every expression of disdain, every cruel smile, and something in him, the last restraint, the last thread of patience, finally snapped. It happened so fast the twins barely had time to process. Daniel moved with surprising speed for someone so large. His right hand grabbed Bernardo's throat before he could react, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. His left hand caught Balthazar by the collar when he tried to back away, pulling him back with a force that nearly took him off his feet. For a moment, the three were frozen in that tableau, Daniel holding the two men who had tortured his mother, the twins finally feeling real fear for the first time in their privileged lives. Daniel didn't squeeze, didn't hurt, just held, his eyes moving between the two pale faces, seeing the terror being born there. He wanted them to feel a fraction of what his mother had felt. He wanted them to know what it was like to be completely at the mercy of someone stronger. Then, slowly, he released them. Bernardo fell to his knees, coughing, his hands flying to his throat. Balthazar stumbled backward, almost falling, his eyes wide with shock and rage. You dared touch me," Bernardo shouted when he recovered his voice. But there was fear breaking through the words. Daniel just looked at them, his expression impassive. He didn't move to attack again. He had done what he wanted, shown that his gentleness was choice, not weakness, that his size wasn't just for work, that he could, if he chose, be far more dangerous than anyone imagined. Balthazar was the first to perceive the real situation. "We need to get out of here. Now." They backed toward the door, keeping their eyes on Daniel, expecting him to attack. But Daniel just stood there watching them go, as motionless as a mountain. When they emerged from the sawmill into the sunlight, the twins practically ran back to the main house. Their fine clothes were disheveled, their pride wounded, fear still pulsing in their veins. But fear in men accustomed to absolute power quickly transforms into vengeful fury. "I'm going to have that animal hanged," shouted Bernardo when they reached the veranda, his face red with humiliation. "I'll personally put the rope around his neck." "Calm down," said Balthazar, thinking more coldly despite his own fear. "If we kill him like that, so obviously, it'll raise questions. Father doesn't like losing valuable property without justification. He attacked me." Bernardo touched his throat where red marks were beginning to appear. "He held you," corrected Balthazar. "He didn't squeeze, didn't really hurt. Technically, he could claim he was defending himself if we said we attacked him first. And everyone on the estate knows we went there to provoke him." Bernardo hated when his brother was right. "So, what do you suggest?" Balthazar thought for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he elaborated a plan. "His mother, Helena. We'll take her. We can do whatever we want with her. Father won't question punishment of a problematic slave. And Daniel will have to watch. He'll have to feel it. But he won't be able to do anything if he doesn't want to make things worse." It was pure, calculated cruelty. And Bernardo smiled slowly as he understood. "You're diabolical, brother." "I'm practical," responded Balthazar. "Revenge is better served when the victim actually suffers. Killing Daniel would be too quick. Making him watch his mother be destroyed, that's real suffering." They sent for the overseer, a brutal man named Sebastio, who executed punishments without questioning. They gave orders to bring Helena to the central courtyard where everyone could see. The news spread through the estate like fire in dry grass. People stopped working, fear running through the community. Everyone knew what it meant when someone was taken to the central courtyard. It meant public punishment, made as an example. Rosa ran to the sawmill, her old legs protesting against the speed. She found Daniel still standing in the same place where he had confronted the twins, looking at his own hands as if he didn't recognize them. She planted herself in front of him, gesturing wildly until she got his attention. When Daniel focused on her, Rosa exaggerated the words on her lips, Helena. Courtyard. Now. Punishment, the blood drained from Daniel's face. He understood immediately, there were consequences for what he had done, and those consequences would fall on his mother. He ran. Daniel crossed the estate in enormous strides, people moving out of his way when they saw him coming. He arrived at the central courtyard the moment Sebastio was tying Helena to a punishment post. She was already crying, not from pain yet, but from fear of what she knew was coming. When she saw Daniel running toward her, her eyes widened in terror. Not for herself, but for him. She shook her head violently, gesturing desperately for him to stop, to stay away, to not make things worse. But Daniel didn't stop. The twins were on the veranda watching. When they saw Daniel approaching, Balthazar smiled. Look at that. He came to watch. Daniel reached the edge of the courtyard and stopped. His fists were clenched, his entire body trembling with contained fury. But he didn't enter the circle, didn't advance further. He knew that any movement from him would only worsen his mother's suffering. Sebastio raised the whip, waiting for the signal from the twins. 20 lashes, ordered Bernardo, his eyes fixed on Daniel. And I want them hard. The first blow fell, and Helena screamed. The sound tore through the silent air, and people flinched in sympathy. Daniel took a step forward involuntarily, but forced himself to stop. The second blow, the third, each one tearing another scream from Helena, each one ripping more skin from her back, each one dripping blood onto the dirt floor. Daniel watched every moment. He didn't look away, didn't close his eyes. He forced himself to witness completely what his action had caused. Tears ran freely down his face, but he remained standing, his absolute helplessness pressing against him like a physical weight. At 10 blows, Helena had stopped screaming. She just moaned weakly, her body jerking with each impact. Daniel couldn't take it anymore. He began walking toward the circle, ready to stop this, damn the consequences. But then Helena raised her head, finding his eyes through tears and pain. And she shook her head, a clear, emphatic denial. She was saying, no, don't sacrifice yourself for me. Don't destroy your future because of these minutes. Don't let them kill you, because I can't live knowing I died for nothing. Daniel stopped, torn between every instinct he had and his mother's silent plea. The blows continued. 15. 18. 20. When it ended, Helena was hanging from the ropes that bound her, unconscious or nearly so. Sebastio untied her, and she collapsed to the ground, her body a map of bleeding wounds. Now, said Balthazar, loud enough for everyone to hear, this happens to those who forget their place. And to the families of those who forget their place. Daniel was on his knees, watching, his fallen mother destroyed inside. Rosa and other women ran to help Helena, carefully carrying her away from the courtyard. When they passed Daniel, Rosa stopped for a moment. She looked at him, and her eyes conveyed a clear message, this is their fault, not yours. Remember that, Daniel remained kneeling there for a long time after everyone left. The sun beating mercilessly, the dust settling, the world continuing as if nothing terrible had happened. But something had changed fundamentally. The anger Daniel had felt before was hot, impulsive. This was different. This was cold, calculated, relentless. He had tried to be kind. He had tried to be just big enough to defend himself. And his mother had paid the price. He wouldn't try halfway anymore. Either he would accept complete submission, or he would embrace complete rebellion. And submission was no longer in his heart. Night fell over the Belmont estate, loaded with tension. Helena was cared for by the women in one of the slave quarters, her back treated with the few available herbs, her wounds cleaned with water that burned as much as the whip. She drifted in and out of consciousness, feverish and weak from blood loss. Daniel remained by her side all night, holding her hand, his massive presence occupying the entire small space. The women who cared for Helena worked around him, not asking him to move. No one had the courage, and everyone understood his vigil. In the early hours of the morning, Helena finally woke completely. Her eyes found Daniel, and fresh tears streamed down. He gently touched her face, careful not to hurt. Then he formed words with his lips slowly, "I'm sorry. My fault, Helena shook her head with all the strength she could muster. She gestured back, her movements weak but emphatic, "No. There's. Always there's, It was a moment of absolute clarity between mother and son. A recognition that evil wasn't in the victims who defended themselves, but in the systems that made defense necessary. That guilt didn't belong to the oppressed who finally said no, but to the oppressors who created conditions where no meant death. Daniel nodded slowly, something solidifying in his chest. Not just rage, but purpose. A terrible, beautiful purpose that came from finally understanding what Rosa had tried to tell him. This wasn't his fault, the blame belonged entirely to those who held the whips, not to those who finally refused to be struck. Helena's breathing steadied as the herbs began to work, pulling her toward healing sleep. Before she closed her eyes, she touched Daniel's face one more time, and he saw in her gaze not fear for what he might do, but trust. Trust that whatever he chose, it would come from love, not cruelty. That he would never become what they were, no matter what actions he took. When she finally slept, Daniel carefully extracted his hand from hers and stood. The other women in the room watched him with wide eyes. They had all seen what he did at the sawmill, had heard the stories growing with each retelling. Rosa approached him, her weathered face serious. She gestured carefully, making sure he understood every sign. "What will you do?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then his hands formed words in the sign language they had developed together over years. "Justice." Rosa nodded slowly. She didn't ask what that meant. In her 6 decades of life, she had learned that justice wore many faces. And in a world as twisted as theirs, sometimes the face of justice looked like vengeance, and that was acceptable. "Be careful," she signed back. "The world isn't ready for what you might become." Daniel's response was simple. The world should have thought of that before he left the slave quarters as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. The estate was still mostly asleep, the exhausted enslaved people catching what little rest they could before another brutal day, the white inhabitants sleeping soundly in their comfortable beds, protected by laws and guns and the certainty of their own superiority. Daniel moved through the darkness like a ghost despite his size. His years of navigating by feel and vibration had taught him how to walk silently, how to sense obstacles before encountering them, how to become invisible when necessary. He went first to the sawmill. The tools he needed were there. Not weapons in the traditional sense, but in his hands, everything became a weapon. He selected carefully, a heavy mallet, rope, and several long iron nails used for construction. He also took a thick canvas tarp, folding it and securing it across his broad back. Then he began the walk to the main house. It stood on the hill like a monument to stolen wealth, its white walls gleaming in the pre-dawn light, 2 stories of elegant architecture built by enslaved hands for people who would never acknowledge the labor that created their comfort. Daniel had been inside exactly twice in his life, once as a child when his mother worked as a house slave before being reassigned to the fields, and once 3 years ago when he had to repair a collapsed ceiling beam. He remembered the layout perfectly. His mind catalogued spaces the way other people catalogued faces. The Drummond twins slept in adjacent rooms on the 2nd floor, on the eastern side of the house. Their windows faced the rising sun, and both young men were known for sleeping late, their bodies soft from lives without labor. Daniel studied the house from the tree line, calculating. The household staff would be waking soon. The cook needed to start breakfast. The maids would begin their cleaning. But for this brief window, perhaps 30 minutes, the house would be at its most vulnerable. He moved closer, his bare feet silent on the grass. The front door would be locked, but he knew from his previous visit that the door to the root cellar was often left unsecured. A lazy oversight by people who never imagined they might need to fear intrusion. The cellar door opened with barely a whisper. Daniel descended into darkness that meant nothing to him. He had lived in a different kind of darkness all his life, and physical darkness was almost comforting. He navigated by touch and memory, finding the stairs that led up into the main house. The door at the top of the cellar stairs opened into a narrow hallway near the kitchen. Daniel paused, feeling the vibrations through the floor. No movement yet. The house still slept. He climbed the servants' stairs to the second floor, each step placed with infinite care. The wood was old and prone to creaking, but Daniel's sensitivity to vibration let him find the quiet spots, the places where the boards were solid and silent. The hallway on the second floor stretched before him, lined with doors. He counted them off in his mind: the master bedroom at the far end where Donna Amelia slept, 2 guest rooms in the middle, and then the twins' rooms on the east end. Bernardo's room was first. Daniel stood outside the door, his hand on the handle, and allowed himself one moment of doubt. What he was about to do would change everything, would end his life. Certainly they would hunt him, catch him, kill him in the most brutal way imaginable as an example to others. But then he thought of his mother's torn back, of the screams they had forced from her, of the casual cruelty in their eyes as they ordered her punishment, of the fact that this would happen again and again, to her, to others, to everyone, because men like the Drummond twins never stopped until they were stopped. He opened the door. Bernardo slept in a large bed covered with fine linens, his face peaceful in the gray dawn light. He looked younger in sleep, almost innocent, and for a moment Daniel felt something twist in his chest. Then he remembered, this innocent-looking face had smiled while ordering 20 lashes. Daniel moved across the room in 3 silent strides. He placed one massive hand over Bernardo's mouth and nose, cutting off air and sound simultaneously. Bernardo's eyes flew open, wild with terror and confusion, seeing the enormous silhouette looming over him in the dim light. Daniel leaned close, making sure Bernardo could see his face, could see his lips as he formed words: "For my mother." Bernardo thrashed, trying to scream, trying to fight, but it was like a child fighting a mountain. Daniel's other hand pressed against his chest, pinning him to the bed with irresistible force. Not squeezing his throat, Daniel wanted him conscious for what came next. With practiced efficiency born from years of working with rope, Daniel bound Bernardo's hands and feet, then gagged him with a strip of the fine linen sheet. The young man's eyes were enormous, tears streaming down his face, his body trembling with primal terror. Daniel left him there and moved to Baltazar's room. The second twin was also asleep, though he stirred as Daniel entered, some unconscious sense of danger penetrating his dreams. His eyes opened just as Daniel's hand clamped over his face. The same terror, the same helpless thrashing, the same efficient binding. When both twins were secured, Daniel carried them one at a time down the servants' stairs. They weighed nothing to him despite their struggles. He brought them to the cellar, laying them side by side on the cold, dirt floor. Then he went back upstairs and retrieved the canvas tarp from where he'd left it. He also took 2 of the pillows from Bernardo's bed. Back in the cellar, Daniel sat on a crate and looked at his captives in the darkness that his eyes couldn't perceive but his other senses mapped perfectly. He could feel their terror like heat radiating from their bodies. He reached out and removed Bernardo's gag. "Please," Bernardo gasped immediately, his voice breaking. "Please, we're sorry, we didn't mean." Daniel replaced the gag. He didn't need to hear lies. He removed Baltazar's gag next. "My father will pay anything," Baltazar said, his voice shaking but trying for calculated reason even now. "Any price you want, freedom, money, we can arrange." Daniel gagged him again. Still lies. Still trying to manipulate, to find an angle, to use the power structures that had always protected them. He removed both gags one final time and, in the pre-dawn darkness of the cellar, did something he hadn't done since childhood. He made a sound, not words exactly. His deaf voice couldn't form proper words, had never learned the precise modulations of speech, but he could make sound, crude and raw and terrible. A long, low, mournful sound that was part groan, part howl, part question thrown at an unjust universe. Both twins stopped moving, shocked into stillness by this sound from the giant they'd dismissed as defective. Then Daniel stood, towering over them in the darkness, and made his choice. He didn't kill them. Despite everything, despite the rage and the justice and the terrible logic that said they deserved death, he didn't kill them. Instead, he tied the canvas tarp over them like a tent, sealing them in darkness. He placed the pillows from Bernardo's bed inside with them, not as comfort, but so their eventual screams would be muffled. Then he piled heavy sacks of grain and flour around and on top of the tarp, creating a prison that wouldn't be easily discovered. They would be found eventually. The household would wake, would notice them missing, would search. It might take hours, it might take a day, but they would be found, alive, terrified, humiliated, but alive. And in that moment of mercy, or perhaps it was the cruelest punishment of all, Daniel showed them that he was more human than they had ever been. That even with every justification for murder, he chose something else. That their cruelty could not make him cruel, only just. Before he left, he removed the gags one final time. He leaned close to each face, making sure they could see his lips in the thin light filtering down from above, and said 2 words they would carry for the rest of their lives, *, remember this. *, then he was gone. Moving back up through the house, out through the cellar door, across the grounds as the sun finally broke the horizon, he returned to the slave quarters to find his mother awake, Rosa helping her sit up despite the pain. When Helena saw Daniel enter, her eyes searched his face, looking for blood, for guilt, for the weight of having become a killer. Instead, she saw something else: peace. Resolution. The face of a man who had been tested by hell itself and had walked out still himself. Daniel knelt beside her and took her hand. He formed words with his free hand, signing in their private language, *, they're alive. They'll be found. But they'll never forget, *. Helena's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of something like pride mixed with relief. Her son had stood up, had acted, had found a way to assert his humanity without losing it in the process. What now? She signed back. Daniel's response was simple: now we see what becomes of monsters who learn to fear. The twins were found 6 hours later, dehydrated and traumatized, their fine clothes soaked with sweat and urine. They couldn't explain what happened, couldn't admit that they had been overpowered so completely, so easily by someone they had called defective. They told their father when he returned 2 days later in a fury that they had been attacked by multiple men, that it must have been an organized revolt, that they barely escaped with their lives. Colonel Drummond ordered investigations, interrogations, punishments, but no one knew anything because there was nothing to know. Daniel had left no evidence, no witnesses, no trail. And strangely, after that day, the twins never bothered another enslaved person again. They never went near the sawmill. They never spoke Daniel's name. They moved through the estate like ghosts, diminished, their cruel confidence shattered by a single night of helplessness. The other enslaved people noticed, and though they never spoke of it openly, they understood. Something had changed. Some invisible line had been crossed. And in the way Daniel walked now, still gentle, still kind, but with a new quality of presence that made even armed overseers step aside, they saw proof that dignity could not be taken, only surrendered, and that sometimes in a world built on violence, the greatest act of rebellion was not to kill your oppressors, but to show them mercy they didn't deserve and could never repay. Helena's back healed slowly, leaving scars that would last a lifetime. But something else healed, too. Some wound deeper than physical. Some breaking of spirit that had threatened to destroy them both. Mother and son survived. The system that sought to crush them continued, would continue for years until greater forces than any individual could finally tear it down. But in that survival, in that moment when Daniel chose justice over vengeance, mercy over murder, humanity over hatred, in that moment, they had already won the only victory that truly mattered. They had remained themselves. And in the pre-dawn darkness of the Belmont estate cellar, 2 young men who had thought themselves gods learned a lesson they would carry forever, that true power doesn't come from cruelty or ownership or law. It comes from knowing who you are when everything tries to tell you you're nothing. And that a deaf man of 7 feet 2 inches, born into chains, had more strength in his gentleness than they would ever possess in all their violence. The sun rose on August 5, 1858, and the world, in some small but irreversible way, was different.